The dust hung low, not like a storm but like a sentence, settling slow and inescapable. Every eye in town had turned toward the wooden platform at the edge of the square, where the auction bell had long since fallen silent. 3 girls stood barefoot beneath the midday sun, each bound at the wrists with frayed twine. The eldest held her chin high, though the corner of her lip was split. The middle one leaned heavier on one foot than the other, her knee trembling with effort. The youngest, smallest, clutched a cloth doll by the neck and stared straight ahead like she wasn't looking at anything at all. Their stepmother stood off to the side with her arms folded, wide-faced and tight-lipped, a large stained bonnet tied too tight beneath her chin. Agnes Harper, widow once and wife twice, the kind of woman whose word carried farther than her warmth. When asked why she was selling the girls, she'd only said, "Ain't got room for dead weight." Jedediah Boone was late to town on purpose. He'd ridden in just before noon, his horse moving slow, half from heat and half from Jed's reluctance. He hadn't come for livestock or liquor or sermons. He'd come to pay off a feed debt and maybe trade for more nails. But when he'd seen the crowd gathered at the auction fence, he'd known something was wrong. Folks didn't gather like that for steers or wagons. He didn't tie his horse. Just swung down from the saddle, removed his hat, and stepped into the hush. The girls didn't move when he came forward. They didn't flinch either. That was what hit him first. Not fear, but that raw, hard absence of it. Like the worst had already come, and anything after was just noise. Mayor Silas Barlow stood near the auction block, sweating through his vest, trying to look noble. His voice had grown louder with each bid-less minute, trying to keep the ugliness respectable. 3 mouths to feed. Fine bone structure. Strong backs. One's nearly a woman. Would make good help for anyone with a bit of land. Someone coughed. Another spat. The bids never came. Barlow looked ready to walk off, to call the thing done and wash his hands of it. Then his eyes caught Jed, standing at the edge of the platform. For a moment, the mayor's smirk faltered. "Well now," Barlow said, voice slick. "Didn't expect you to crawl into town today, Boone." Jed didn't answer. He looked at the girls, first the eldest, whose face said she was holding up the sky with her shoulders. Then the middle one, whose lips were pressed tight from pain she didn't speak of. Then the little one, who stared straight through him. "Done working with animals?" Barlow sneered. "Looking for company now, are you?" Jed took something from his coat pocket. It wasn't large, just a small cloth pouch, knotted at the top. He stepped forward, placed it on the edge of the platform. The sound of coin hitting wood was louder than thunder in that silence. The whole square exhaled at once. "Jed," Barlow began, tone sharpening, "that ain't what this is." Jed met his eyes. That was enough. Barlow raised both hands and took a step back like he'd touched something hot. "So be it," he said, nearly choking on the words. Jed pulled out a blade. Not fast, not with threat. Just a tool from his belt, worn and clean. He cut the twine around the eldest girl's wrists first. She didn't flinch, but her fingers stayed clenched even when they were free. Then he moved to the middle one, careful with the knot near her swollen wrist. Lastly, he knelt before the littlest one. She didn't meet his gaze as he undid the last tie. She just reached for his coat and held on. The girls stepped down from the platform like shadows slipping from a wall. Jed said nothing. Didn't offer his name, didn't explain. He just walked, slow and steady, down the main street. 2 girls at his side, one in his arms, all of them following a man who hadn't meant to save anybody that morning. The crowd parted. Some stared with pity, others with disgust. But no one stopped him. Behind them, Barlow turned to Agnes Harper. "You sold them for $10. She sniffed. "They weren't worth 12. Jed didn't look back. The ride home was long and quiet. The girls rode in the back of the wagon, heads low, hands clutching whatever rope or board gave them balance. The land rolled on without speaking, fence posts like crooked teeth, wheat fields too brittle from drought. Jed didn't speak either. He didn't know what to say. He only stopped once, beside the creek that ran slow this time of year, and handed out pieces of jerky and a dented canteen. They didn't thank him. He didn't expect them to. By the time the sun dipped low and threw gold across the grass, the ranch house came into view, bare-boned and stubborn. One chimney, a half-fixed porch, and a barn that leaned like it wanted to lie down but hadn't given up yet. The girls stepped down without being asked. Susanna, the eldest, took the little one's hand. Jed showed them the bunk room. 3 cots. A basin. A single oil lamp. No locks. "I'll bring Stu in a bit," he said, voice low. "There's clean blankets on the shelf." They didn't answer. He didn't press. He ate alone on the porch, bowl in hand, watching the wind stir the wheat. Inside, he heard only the creak of floorboards and the sound of water being poured. He thought about the town, the way they looked at him, the words he'd already heard whispered. "There'll be talk, Boone. You know that." He didn't care about the talk. He cared about the silence that followed it, the way it curled around a man's house like fog, how it made folks stop coming by, made doors shut a little quicker. But he remembered a night 7 years ago, sitting on that same porch, holding a child-sized coffin while his wife wept behind him. He remembered silence then, too. Not cruel. Just unbearable. He wasn't afraid of being alone. He was afraid of staying that way. Later, when he brought Stu to the bunk room, he found the bowl already there. Empty. Licked clean. The girls were curled on their beds, Nellie tucked beneath a quilt too big for her. No one had undressed. Boots were still on. Hair still braided. Susanna looked at him once. Not a thank you. Not a smile. But she looked. He closed the door gently. That night, he sat by the fire with a small wooden box in his lap. Inside was a ring, worn smooth with time. His wife's. He held it between his fingers. Not because he needed it, but because it reminded him what kindness used to feel like when it wasn't rusted by years. Outside, the wind howled low, and somewhere behind the bunkroom door, a child whispered in sleep one word. Safe. Jed leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. He hadn't meant to buy anyone that day. But somehow, without asking, they'd made him feel like a man again. Not a savior. Not a saint. Just someone who hadn't turned away. And that, he thought, was something worth holding on to. The rooster crowed long before the sun crested the hills, but Susanna was already up. She moved like she didn't trust the stillness, like sleep was a trick meant to catch the unguarded. Her fingers worked the kindling in the stove with practiced precision, her jaw tight as she coaxed the flame to life. Her shoulders bore a tension that didn't ease even when the warmth spread. The silence of the house pressed against the walls, heavy and listening. She hadn't asked to stay. None of them had. And yet they had woken here for 3 mornings now, still breathing, still untouched. That in itself felt strange. Outside, the world was hushed, save the distant cough of cattle and the creak of wind against the barn. Susanna stepped onto the porch, boots laced tight, skirt tucked into worn trousers. The woodpile near the shed was nearly gone, and so she picked up the axe. The first swing echoed like thunder. The second, like a dare. Jed watched from the barn's shadow, a hay fork leaning against his hip. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just nodded once, slow and quiet. And Susanna, for the first time, didn't look away. Evie appeared a little later, limping as always but determined. She carried a bundle of flour, setting it on the counter like it weighed more than she did. Her movements were careful, guarded, not out of fear of breaking anything, but fear of being seen trying. Jed returned from the field, hands rough with frostbitten air, and found bread baking in his kitchen. The scent was faint, hopeful, even. Evie never looked up when he came in. She just kept kneading, shoulders trembling with effort. "I'll patch that fence this afternoon," Jed said, as if it were any other day. "Might need a second pair of hands." Susanna said nothing from the corner, where she stood cleaning his wife's old lantern. Jed didn't push. He didn't point. He just left the barn door open. That afternoon, Susanna followed him to the broken fence. Jed handed her wire and said, "Mend where you can. If it holds, it holds. If not, we fix it again." She paused, brows furrowed. Why? He didn't turn around. Because it's mine. That answer seemed to settle something between them. In town, the gossip bloomed like weeds. They said Jed Boone had taken in girls too young to wed and too old to ignore. They said his house was full of silence because sin doesn't speak. They said the girls were strange. Didn't talk, didn't beg, didn't run. Mayor Barlow made sure the words spread fast. Jed returned from town with supplies and a black eye that wasn't explained. He handed Evie a spool of thread and said nothing about the limp in his gait. The girls didn't ask. But that night, a fresh biscuit appeared beside his plate, butter melting slow across the top. The next morning, Nellie laughed. It wasn't much. Just a small sound, almost a cough, when a bird landed on the porch rail and flapped its wings too wide. But it was real. Jed looked over from the pump and caught the sound in his chest like a spark in a cold stove. He didn't smile, but something loosened in his face. Susanna heard it too. She didn't show it, but when she cleaned the kitchen later, she hummed. Low. Nearly inaudible. A tune without words. That evening, Evie tripped near the barn, her knee buckling hard in the dirt. Jed crossed the yard fast, helped her sit up. She shook her head, refusing his hand, but tears slipped down her cheek without permission. I can still work, she said, chin trembling. You ain't livestock, Jed replied. Work don't prove your worth here. She looked away, hands knotted in her skirt. He didn't touch her again. Just said, I'll fix a brace. Might help. And he did. That night, by lantern light, he carved a makeshift leg brace from old ashwood and leather scraps. He didn't ask if she'd wear it. He just left it on her cot. In the morning, it was gone. Worn. Dust on the straps. On the 5th day, a stranger came riding. He wasn't dressed like a rancher. Too clean. Too stiff. His horse was city-bred, too. Nostrils flared at every sound. He stopped at the gate and called out, not waiting to be welcomed. Jed met him near the corral, eyes narrowed, rifle cradled against his chest but not aimed. You Boone. Jed didn't answer. The man sniffed. Name's Corley. I hear you're housing 3 girls. Girls that don't belong to you. Jed didn't blink. They don't belong to anyone. Well, Corley smirked, the town's starting to think otherwise. There's talk of intervention. You understand what that means. Jed's jaw worked slow, like he was chewing the thought. Then he said, You finished. Corley looked around, eyes landing on the barn, the porch, the quiet hills beyond. Not yet. But he left anyway. That night, Susanna found a note nailed to the gate. Return what's not yours, or face what's coming. She brought it to Jed, eyes dark. You know who. Jed didn't look at the paper. Don't need to. Why won't you send us away? Because you're not livestock. Susanna swallowed hard. That's not what they think. Jed finally looked at her, slow and steady. I don't care what they think. I care what you do next. That stopped her. Inside the house, Nellie had made something. Poorly sewn but clearly meant to be a doll dress, cut from an old pillowcase. She held it out to Jed like a peace offering. He accepted it without a word, tied it around the rag doll she always carried. Evie watched from the stairwell. She didn't smile, but her eyes shone. On the 7th morning, there was a visitor at the church. Mayor Barlow stood before the pulpit, shouting to the crowd about decency, about morality, about the dangers of silence. He said Jed Boone was no hero. That taking in girls that weren't yours invited God's wrath. That the town had a right to protect its own. Someone in the crowd asked, Did the girls say they weren't safe? Barlow paused. Children don't always know they're in danger. A murmur followed. Back at the ranch, Jed hammered new boards into the stable wall while Susanna fetched nails without being asked. Evie swept the porch. Nellie chased a beetle and laughed when it vanished under a rock. Jed looked up, hands paused. Watched the girls as they moved, like they were beginning to trust the space they walked in. That night, he found a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth on the table. It was uneven. burned on one side. But when he cut into it, it was warm and soft and smelled like something trying hard to be whole. He left a coin beneath the plate. Susanna found it at dawn. In town, Corley returned. This time with papers. Legal-looking ones. Guardianship challenges, written by men who'd never laid eyes on the girls. He passed them to the sheriff, who passed them to the preacher, who passed them to the whispering mouths at the general store. Jed didn't react when the sheriff rode out. He greeted him at the fence, calm as ever. "You planning to marry one of them?" the sheriff asked. Jed didn't flinch. "Not unless she asks. You know how this looks, Boone. Looks don't change truth." The sheriff spat. "Then you better be right about yours." And he left, not satisfied, but not sure enough to stay. That night, the air smelled like something waiting to break. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, silent and cruel. Inside, the girls sat by the fire. Susanna read from an old book, Evie darning socks, Nellie asleep in her lap. Jed watched from the doorway, his coat still on, hat in hand. "Town's stirring," he said. Susanna didn't look up. "Let 'em stir." Evie smiled. For a moment, it felt like the house was full of something other than past. Not freedom, not peace, but choice. And that was more than they'd ever had. In the quiet, Jed said the one thing they hadn't heard yet. "You can stay, long as you want." Susanna looked up. Then, slow as sunrise, she nodded once. Not to him, but to the fire, and maybe to the girl she used to be. Outside, thunder cracked. Inside, no one moved. The sky cracked open the morning the letter arrived, a slit of silver in a slate-colored sky. Rain had been threatening for days, coiling in the clouds like a story unsaid. The first drops hit the dust with a hiss, just enough to darken the earth, not enough to cleanse it. Jed found the envelope tucked beneath the grain sack, damp around the corners, the paper curling as if it already knew it carried bad news. There was no return name, just a red wax seal, smudged at the edge. He didn't open it right away. He stared at it for a long time, his thumb brushing the fold, his body still as the old fence post beside him. The girls were inside, Evie humming while kneading dough, Nellie dragging her doll across the floor with wild abandon. Susanna stood by the window, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the rain. She looked like someone waiting for a war to start, though it had already begun. Jed didn't show them the letter. He took it to the barn, sat in the shadow of the loft, and slit it open with the corner of his pocketknife. The words inside were few and bitter. Jedediah Boone. Notice of repossession for unpaid loan. 3 months past due. Land and livestock to be claimed if balance not settled in full. Below that, a signature he recognized from years ago. Claymore Banks, a name that tasted like copper and old debt. He folded the letter slowly and slipped it into his coat. Outside, the rain gathered pace. It beat down steady, coating the porch in a silver sheen, sliding off the roof in rhythmic threads. Inside, laughter echoed from the parlor, Nellie pretending her doll could fly. Evie giggled once, light and unsure, and Jed stood in the barn feeling like a ghost watching someone else's life. That evening, he patched the barn roof in the rain, hammering shingle over shingle, water slicking his shoulders. Susanna brought him a dry shirt without a word, left it hanging from a nail. He didn't put it on until long after she left. Later, he watched her from the porch as she walked the fence line, checking for breaches even the cows had stopped testing. She moved with purpose now, less like someone waiting to be sent away. The land had changed her. Not softened, not exactly, but steadied her. Back in town, the whispers turned sharper. Corley had returned. This time, with talk of enforcement. That Boone was squatting on borrowed land. That the girls were being hidden from a rightful future. That the sheriff might finally act. The preacher preached fire and judgment. Mayor Barlow made sure every shopkeeper heard the same sermon. He bought them. Now he's keeping them. What kind of man does that without a price in mind? Jed didn't respond. He didn't ride into town. He didn't send word. He just worked, mending fence, hauling feed, watching the sky grow darker each day. 3 nights later, Susanna found the letter. It was under his pillow, the corner of the wax seal peeking out like a splinter. She didn't open it, just stared at it, then looked at Jed where he sat by the fire, hands motionless over a pot of stew. "You're in trouble," she said. His eyes flicked to hers, then back to the fire. "Not the kind that ends with dying." She stood silent for a long time. Then, "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because it's mine to carry." Her jaw clenched. "We're not cattle, Jed." "I know." She stepped closer, voice low. "Then stop treating us like freight that's already fallen off the wagon." Jed didn't reply. The fire snapped between them. That night, Susanna didn't sleep. She stood by the window as the rain poured harder, watching the barn sway in the wind, eyes glassy. At some point, Evie joined her, thin arms wrapping around her waist. Nellie slept in the cot beside them, her doll missing a shoe. Morning brought no relief. Just more water, more wind, and a trail of hoofprints leading up the muddy road. The sheriff. He rode in slow, a yellow oilskin pulled tight around his shoulders. He didn't draw his weapon, but his hand stayed near it. Behind him came Corley, smug in a high-collared coat, eyes sweeping the ranch like he was counting possessions. Jed stepped off the porch and waited. "We got business," the sheriff said, nodding toward the barn. "Mind stepping inside?" Jed led them in. The barn smelled of rain and hay and tension. Corley pulled out a paper, more formal than the last, with seals and signatures and words that meant ownership. "You're in default," Corley said, lips curled. "We're here to seize what's owed." Jed said nothing. "You can keep the house, for now. But the land, the livestock, they're collateral. So are any dependents in your care." Jed's mouth twitched. "They're not property." Corley smiled, a thin thing. "Neither is a debt. But it still takes." The sheriff didn't look pleased. He shuffled his feet, glanced toward the door. "You'll have a week. But if you can't prove payment." Jed raised a hand. "You'll come for them." No one answered. When they left, Susanna met Jed by the door. "I heard." "Didn't hide it this time." Evie stood behind her, holding Nellie's hand. Susanna's voice was steel. "We'll help." Jed looked at her, really looked, and saw the fury in her eyes. Not fear. Not shame. A readiness. "I'm not letting them take you," he said. "You won't have to." That night, he lit a match. It was small. Just one. He held it over the fireplace, letter burning between 2 fingers. The flames curled the paper like parchment peeling from skin. He didn't flinch. "What's it say?" Evie whispered. Jed watched it turn to ash. That the past's still hungry. Outside, the rain kept falling. The girls stood beside him. Not huddled. Not hidden. Just there. The storm beat the roof like a drum. And somewhere in the dark, a plan began to take shape, not with weapons, not with threats, but with something stronger. Refusal. They would not be taken. Not again. The sun rose bruised and red behind the clouds, casting a copper light over the soaked earth. The rain had broken sometime after midnight, but the scent of it clung to the land like smoke after a fire, something finished, but not forgotten. Jed stood by the corral with a rope in hand, watching the sky like it might lie to him. He hadn't slept. Not well. Not fully. Just enough to hear the wind change and feel the weight of what was coming. They would come today. He knew it the way animals sense a quake before it hits. The girls moved about the ranch with the same awareness. Evie lit the stove with shaking hands. Susanna brushed the porch clean with more force than needed. Nellie sat on the steps, braiding her doll's torn dress with a concentration far too intense for a child her size. The moment cracked at noon. 3 horses crested the ridge. Mayor Barlow in his best vest, the sheriff behind him with a heavy face, and Corley last, wearing a clean hat and a smile like wrought under varnish. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. The law traveled on its own weight. Jed didn't meet them in the yard this time. He stood on the porch, boots spread wide, arms at his sides, as though the boards beneath him were sacred ground. "Boone," the sheriff called. "We gave you time." Jed nodded. "I didn't ask for it." Barlow shifted in his saddle, voice loud and performative. "This ain't personal. You broke law. You kept girls who ain't yours. You owe what you can't pay." Susanna stepped out behind Jed. "You mean we're what he owes?" Barlow's eyes twitched. "You've no legal standing, miss." "She's got mine," Jed said. Corley dismounted, pulled a paper from his satchel. "Your word doesn't mean much, Boone. Not in matters of debt." Jed didn't move. "Then why bring the sheriff?" Barlow's smile faded. "We're seizing property," Corley said. "That includes livestock, land, and any unregistered dependents under your care." Evie appeared beside Susanna now, clutching a folded piece of linen. Her brace creaked faintly with each step. Nellie stayed by the door, too small to understand all the words, but old enough to know something ugly was trying to enter their house. The sheriff cleared his throat. "We don't want this to get hard." "Then turn around," Jed said, voice low. "There's nothing here you're taking." Barlow slid off his horse. "You'd defy the law?" "I'd protect my home." Corley handed the paper to the sheriff, who looked at it like it burned. "Jed," he said almost gently, "if they come with us quiet, maybe this ends without jail." Susanna stepped forward. "I'll go," she said. Jed's breath hitched. Susanna's eyes stayed fixed on Barlow. "If that's what it takes. You leave the little ones. Take me. I'll sign whatever it takes." "No," Jed said. But Susanna kept speaking. "You want the law to look clean. Fine. I'll marry him." She turned to Jed now, her face unreadable. "Marry me. Before they touch my sisters." Jed stared at her. He saw the terror she refused to show, the steel she'd worn for weeks. He saw the little girl still inside her, screaming behind her ribs. And he saw the same vow he'd once made to a dying woman: let them be safe. That's all. He stepped down into the mud, reached into his coat. The ring was old, the gold dulled by time, his wife's name etched faintly on the inside. He held it in his palm for a long second, then knelt in the dirt, not for the crowd, not for show, but because some things must be done humbly. He looked up at Susanna. Not for protection, not for appearances. She nodded, tears caught but unshed. "I know." He slid the ring onto her finger. For a moment, the world held its breath. Barlow scoffed. "This is desperation, not law." Jed rose, slow and deliberate. "Then call it what you like. But that girl's my wife now. That one's my kin. That little one, she calls me safe." Corley snarled. "This won't hold." Jed reached behind him and drew the old rifle from beneath the porch rail. Not fast, not threatening, just enough to remind them who he'd once been. "You'll leave now." The sheriff looked tired. He turned his horse without a word. Corley spat in the mud and followed. Barlow lingered, eyes sharp with pride's last flicker. "You think this means they'll forget?" Jed stared back. "I don't need them to forget. I need them to look me in the eye and know I didn't turn away." Barlow mounted his horse and rode off without another word. The dust settled. The girls stood frozen. Jed let out a breath that felt like he hadn't taken one since the day he first saw them on that platform. Behind him, Susanna twisted the ring on her finger. It didn't fit right. Not yet. That evening, they sat around the fire. Jed on the floor, back to the hearth. Susanna beside him, silent but no longer distant. Evie read aloud from a weathered book. Nellie curled up with her doll, wearing a smile that didn't seem borrowed anymore. Outside, the storm was finally gone. And for the first time, they weren't surviving. They were staying. They were choosing. And under the floorboards, buried deep in the dirt, the letter from the bank slept beside the matchstick he'd used to burn it. Some debts didn't need to be repaid. Some were buried. with vows stronger than signatures, with rings pressed into dirt instead of ledgers, and with the kind of silence that meant a home had finally been claimed. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.